Welcome everyone to this very special Seed Saver Library program. I'm Lisa Jett. I work at the library, and on behalf of the library staff and the partners in the Seed Saver Library, Appalachian Sustainable Development and Appalachian WildSide, we hope you'll enjoy this Earth Day celebration. Seed Saver Library got started, which is now a year ago. In the initial brainstorming sessions, one of our dreams was to have Bill Best as a speaker. So 1 year later, here we are, and so we are honored that he has made the trip from Berea today with his grandson to share his wisdom with us. We have over 100 people registered in our local Seed Saver Library, and we are most appreciative to the Raymon Grace Foundation for its continuation, for its conception and continuation this year. So I'll turn it over to Ben Castile of Appalachian WildSide, who is also an instructor at Virginia Highlands Community College, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks for coming out, and what can we say, and what can we not say about Bill Best here? He's a man of many hats. First and foremost, he's a farmer and has been farming for over 50 years now and growing and saving seeds. He has a bean collection of over 700 varieties of beans exclusively from the Appalachian Mountains, some of which he has for sale today. He's a professor, a school teacher, as well as a food activist and an author. I first learned about Bill a couple of years ago when Renewing America's Food Traditions, also known as RAFT, put out a publication called The Place-Based Foods of Appalachia. And in this publication, Bill was a contributor and told the tale of the noble bean, the humble tale of the noble bean, which is a wonderful, it's a greasy bean, right, Bill? It's a fall bean. Let's see, many of the beans that we have here date back hundreds, some thousands of years to Native Americans growing beans in floodplains in our areas in eastern Kentucky, mostly in the mountains here. Bill is also an author. He's written several books. Today he has his latest publication, Saving Seeds and Preserving Taste, about the heirloom seed savers of Appalachia. Let's see, what else can we say about Bill here? He sells at the Berea Farmers Market, and started the Berea Farmers Market, and also sells at the Lexington Farmers Market. Sells tomato starts and beans, as well as tomatoes. And has over 700 varieties of beans and say over 50 varieties of tomatoes. And mostly looking for nutrition and flavor. And there's also a documentary about Bill through the Southern Foodways Alliance that I just watched the other night. It's a great documentary. I would recommend checking it out. So Bill had his books for sale as well as some beans up here, and we will have some seeds for checking out if you'd like to register with the Seed Savers Library. So without further ado, here's Bill Best.
Thank you, Ben. I've requested sit today. I'm breaking in a new hip, and walking is fine, but standing makes me a little bit fidgety yet. I'm anxious to move, and it's much easier to sit or to walk than to stand. After 18 or so months of constant pain and the orthopedist deciding at what time I was ready, I finally went to Louisville and got it done the anterior method, where they go through the front of the leg rather than the side or the bottom. I had it done a little over 2 months ago, and it's coming along very well. But anyhow, that's why I'm not standing over here today. This is my grandson, Brian, who has worked with me 12 or 13 years now since he was 12 and he's 23. And full-time every summer and almost full-time period. Now he's part-time as a college student as well, but he's come to depend on him very much, including driving me to a lot of the places that we go to. And I was talking with him on the way down about what time he'll be ready to make presentations on my behalf, and he claims not to be ready yet. He's heard me make this presentation long enough that he should be able to make it before too long. I had my first garden on my own in 1963, 51 years ago. Prior to that time, when I was home during the summers from college, my mother had always, by the time I got home, the gardens had pretty well been planted, and I use gardens plural because we have many gardens. With her mother, my grandmother Sanford had several gardens too, and she had one garden straight across from her house, across the road from her house, that whenever anyone came by needing food, she would say, right there, take what you need, and in the garden across from her house. And during that time in the 30s and 40s, there were, up through the mid-40s, I guess there were still quite a few people needing food. And so we had gardens, plural, and that goes all the way back. I got my seed saving habit from my mother, and one of my first memories is when I was about probably 2.5 years old, being out in the cornfield picking the lower hanging beans while she picked the higher hanging beans, and being fascinated by the colors and the whole idea of stringing them and preparing food to eat, so that when I ate beans for supper that night, I had a real sense of value, the fact that I had contributed to what I was eating. I also became aware of the stinging worms on the leaves of the corn, learning especially the pack saddles. Some of you have probably seen the pack saddles. And if your tender hands touch them, you would have welts for quite some time. And so I learned to be very careful of when I was picking beans, so as not to brush up against the stinging worms. Well, to move on quickly to when my wife and I moved to Berea, I was hired to direct the Student Center in 1962. That started my 40-year career at Berea, which involved administration, teaching, and coaching the swim team for 25 years as well. But anyhow, we went together with another couple. Within 6 weeks after we got there, we drove over. Well, we had seen an ad in the paper about, I think, 354 acres for sale for $10,000. So we went together with this other couple, and I don't remember the exact acreage, but it turned out to be $38 an acre, which at that time was a very good deal. So we bought a farm. I hired the little 10-year-old in his overalls and bare feet, and his mule who lived next door, and he got our ground plowed and disc up, and we had our first garden in '63. I ordered my first seeds, and with respect to beans, I guess you would say pretty well my life seeds in that year. I was so distressed and disgusted by the quality of the beans, and some of you may have grown beans like that. They were Blue Lakes, which were a fairly new bean at that time, but they were just unbelievably tough. I had never eaten such tough beans. And so, well, I couldn't eat them because I let them get full. And, in the mountains, I'm sure as all of you know, when you talk about having a mess of beans, you're talking about beans where the hulls are full of seeds. Well, at that time, the definition of bean was changing thanks to the invention of the mechanical bean picker, and beans were being toughened up dramatically so that they wouldn't break during mechanical harvest. And I didn't know that. I was quite naive when I bought my seeds. But then when I complained to my mother that Thanksgiving, we were home in North Carolina for Thanksgiving, and she said, well, I can solve that problem. And so she gave me a bunch of her seeds. And I'd like to say that I've never looked back, but I've actually a couple of times. I actually bought some other beans from the bean seed catalog and another one or two, just to see, just to confirm to myself, or to see if I had been mistaken in my evaluation of these beans that were being developed to spread worldwide. Well, as it turned out, I had not been incorrect in my evaluation of that bean. Not only that, but they have continued to get worse. They have continued to get tougher. And I think it was 1993, Berea College was having an agricultural summit to try to decide what to do with their agriculture department. There were over 100 people invited to speak, invited to listen, several invited speakers, and I was one of the ones that was invited to go to it. And we had a banquet the last night. Well, as in most banquets, green beans were the obligatory staple for the meal. Well, I attempted to puncture one with my fork, and being unsuccessful, I finally picked it up with my finger, put it in my mouth, and chewed and chewed and chewed. And finally gave up, and discreetly took it out of my mouth and put it on the side of my plate. At the end of the banquet, and before the plates were collected, I did a scientific experiment. I walked around the room to see if anyone else had had the problem eating those beans. Not to my surprise, no one had eaten the beans. Every plate in that banquet hall, Boone Tavern, for those of you who've been to Berea College, not a single person had successfully eaten those beans. And then that sort of confirmed my status, the status of the modern bean for me. About 10 years later, I got the Keeper of the Flame Award at the Southern Foodways Alliance for the work that we were doing with seeds at that time. And I told the story of the beans at Boone Tavern. And there were several chefs in attendance, and they just sort of chuckled. And one of them raised his hand finally, and he said, don't you know that we no longer serve beans to be eaten? They're used as a garnish. They're used to decorate the plates. And they thought that I was crazy, expecting that beans were to be served to be eaten. But, and I explained, no, that no one had informed me of that. But now that I have been duly informed, I will inform those of you who may still need to be informed on that. I became a charter member of the Lexington Farmers Market in 1973. I was the youngest member at that time. Now I'm the oldest. I've been with it longer than anyone else. I'm the only charter member left. I started selling heirloom beans and tomatoes that summer, and discovered that the heirloom beans that I'd been growing for several years at that time were immensely popular. And people from this part of Virginia, eastern Kentucky, western North Carolina, who had moved to Lexington, bought in droves those beans from me, and heirloom tomatoes too. I was the first to sell heirloom beans at that market, the first to sell heirloom tomatoes, and they both became very popular. But the story I want to mention about the beans was that people from all over the place started bringing me their family seeds. I wasn't documenting at that time because I didn't anticipate doing what I'm here doing over 40 years later. I didn't anticipate being a bean collector. But anyhow, everyone had a family bean, it seemed, and a story to go with it. And in 1974, seeing our success at the Lexington Farmers Market and knowing that Berea didn't have one, I went around to several of my neighbors to see if they would be interested in helping me start a Berea market. And a bunch of them agreed to grow for the Berea market, and so we got started with probably 10 growers, and sure enough, people in Berea fell in love with even the ones who had never eaten heirloom beans before decided that they might be good. And so they started buying them, and then some of the people started bringing me their seeds from their families too. And so that's one of the things I wrote about in this book, the family beans. And in the Southern Appalachians, it is an unusual family that doesn't have at least one family bean, sometimes many. In my mother's case, 10 years after she died, my sister who had moved back home from Charleston, South Carolina, called me and said, Bill, you probably want to come down and check Mother's freezer because there's a lot of beans in there. And so I did, and 13 varieties, and all 13 of them did very well. 7 years later, she had finally defrosted the freezer. She called me back and said, I found more on the bottom. So I went back and got more, including one that was 35 years old, many of which she had spilled on the bottom of the freezer, and so that as it defrosted and the ice turned to water, most of them had sprouted, and I discovered that also, when I planted them myself, her 35-year-old beans germinated 100%. So I am certainly sold on the idea of keeping beans in the freezer. Now, before Mother got a freezer when she was in her 50s, I guess before we even had running water, she would have been in her 40s. Yeah, she had kept the weevils out with mothballs, and prior to that, she had kept them out with hot peppers. And I have recently just had people inform me, I've got things on my desk in my house right now that were sent to me with the story that that person's family had kept the weevils out with some very pungent tobacco that has been wadded up and put in with them. And of course, I guess nicotine poisonous insects kept them out very well too. But anyhow, my seed saving came about helter-skelter, I guess. I was not documenting. I was just taking the beans that people were bringing me. I would grow them. I would sell them at the farmers markets. Then in 1988, a freelance writer did an article on our farm and our farmers market operation at that time. And my children had been very active in working with me over the years too. Two of them paying their way through college through the farmers market. But anyhow, the Rural Kentuckian magazine carried an article about our operations, and within 6 months, I had received 86 letters from 6 states that article was continuing to be passed around, and just in the last month or so, I have found a woman who told me that she had kept that article and continued to read it. And suddenly, we got all kind of phone calls, visitors, people bringing us seeds to trade, and then suddenly I became a collector of beans, and almost by default. I can't claim any special credit for doing this. It just chose me, I guess you would say, to do this. And so I started being invited to give talks to different places. So I did one in probably 7 or 8 years ago now. The lady from Ohio University Press came up afterward and she said, "Did you put that in the book? That we'd like to publish it." And I said, "Well, give me a year and I'll see what I can do." Well, the year stretched out and it became 6 years. And so finally, I got the book ready, and this is it. Then a few weeks after that, I had a lady from University Press of Kentucky paid me a visit at the Lexington Farmers Market, and she said, "Can you do a book also on Kentucky heirloom fruits and vegetables?" So I said, "You'll be second in line. I'll see what I can do." And so that one hopefully will come out about this time next year. So I spent thousands of miles, hundreds of hours, just visiting and documenting and making sure that I was being accurate in what I was talking about. And I'm still getting people wanting to hear the story of these beans. In the meantime, they're catching on worldwide. Monsanto is my best friend. By being what they are, they have allowed me and encouraged me to become what I am today, and that is trying to preserve their genetic diversity. I'm very glad that the libraries are starting to do it now as well. What the libraries are doing is what the land-grant universities should be doing. Every land-grant university should be responsible for the seed and plant and even animal heritage of that state. Well, you might ask the question, why are they not doing it? Well, they're not doing it because the multinational seed companies are shipping them seeds to experiment with and then promote them. A few years ago, I was at the Kentucky Vegetable Growers meeting, and there were people there from the researchers there from the experiment station, Robinson Experiment Station in Breathitt County, Kentucky. And the young lady was explaining, she said, "We just simply cannot get the people in this area to eat these beans. They just don't like them. They won't accept them." And I spoke up and I said to her, "Why are you trying to sell Yugos to people who are driving Cadillacs?" And a few weeks later, they ordered 13 of my varieties and started growing them. Another part of that story is, in that particular county, where they couldn't get people to eat commercial beans, especially the brand new beans being promoted by the seed companies, I have a friend, former IBM, he's IBM retiring now, but he has found 52 heirloom bean varieties in that county alone. I mean, this is astounding, and I'm convinced that in the southern Appalachians there are probably several thousand. If you can find 52 distinct varieties in one county alone, think of how many there may be here. I have a couple from Virginia here, and if I'd had a little bit more time, I would have brought some more from Virginia. I was trying to remember the name of a fellow that gave me a bunch of Parsons, who gave me a bunch over in Lee County a few years ago. He is now dead, but he's one of the ones that I featured in the book there as well. But anyhow, I'm glad that the libraries have taken over. Several of the libraries in Kentucky have done that too. Julie Marushkin, the Clark County Public Library, who I've also featured in here along with her husband, have been doing this for at least 10 years now. And I can't think of a better place to do it, except I'll still repeat what I said. I think the land-grant university should be doing it. And I think the decline of genetic diversity is something that we should all be concerned about. And any way that we can reverse that, I think we need to do it. I'm going to, I prefer giving interactive presentations. I prefer answering questions, and I prefer having some people tell their stories too. But I'll mention some more about these beans in a minute, but I'd like to invite any questions or comments that anyone would like to give. Yes, sir.
Is there something unique about beans that there would be so many varieties, or can you expect that in most vegetables?
No, you don't expect it in most vegetables. They have a really great habit of mutating. And people in the mountains, if they run across a mutant bean, it's called a sport. And I've got one right here, the Frank Barnett cut short. See if you can find it, Brian. I'll pass this. The cut short, you know, people in the mountains want to eat beans that stick to your ribs, high in protein. Let me give this one here, pass it around. This is a mutant bean that my friend Frank Barnett, who discovered those 52 varieties, found, and a bean that was totally different from that. I've got one too, my Road Mountain bean. Is a long white bean that mutated from a very short brown bean. But I think there are probably more beans in this part of the world, the southern Appalachians, parts of several states here, the mountain parts of several states, than there are in any similar part of the world, including the part of South America where they developed in the first place. But they have a far greater ability to mutate than any other fruit or vegetable that I know of. Certainly far more than tomatoes.
Of these 700 varieties, are most of them, would you consider them shell beans that you
No,
try?
no. Shell beans are the October beans or fall beans. That's what, and I have a thing in here too on, and it's on my website too. I used to get so many calls and emails from people wanting to know about types of beans, so I finally just wrote a bean terminology piece, and the publishers requested that it go in this book too. But most of them are green beans. Most of them, I'd say 90% green beans. And tender hull. Now, with fall beans, there are tender hull fall beans and tough hull fall beans too. The tough hulls, of course, you have to shell out. But the tender hulls, you can break and eat them too. But people in the mountains expect their beans to be tender, full and tender. And thousands of varieties commercially have been reduced to probably 20. All perfectly straight. You know, the normal bean, what I would consider a normal bean, has a slight curve. Creaseback beans have a V in their backbone. Greasy beans are very slick, and you can pull one up between you and the sun, look at the sun, and the skin is so thin that you can see through it. And all of these heirloom beans, when strung and cooked, tend, if strung when they're full and then cooked, you can count on them to the hull and the seeds separate out. I'm sure most of you, I realize I'm preaching to the choir. You know, I'm telling you things that you already know. Most groups that I talk with don't know this stuff, so that's, you have to pardon me for telling you stuff that you already know. But anyhow, and they're very high in protein. The modern bean is protein free, like the modern tomato is lycopene and vitamin free, because they've been bred to be that, because they've been bred to be shipped long distances, have a shelf life of weeks, if not months, and then cooked or prepared. A few years ago, it's been probably 12 or 15 years ago now, time passes pretty fast, but my wife and I like to fry okra and lay it flat on a plate and then slice tomatoes and put it on it and let the tomato slices soak down through the okra. It enhances both the okra and the tomatoes, but we were going to do something a few years ago, and I bought a large pound-sized tomato at our local Mega Mart and left it on the shelf for 2 or 3 weeks to see if it would finally soften up a little bit. It didn't, so finally I said, we'll try it anyhow. And I started cutting it with the knife, and before I even laid it down on the okra, and I said, you know, this smells too much like formaldehyde. I don't think we'll be able to eat it, but we won't totally throw it away. We'll give it to our son, Brian's dad's chicken, and let them have it, since I knew that chickens like tomatoes. But they ran up to these tomato slices, smelled them, and then ran in the opposite direction, which I thought was astounding. But the worst part of that story is, the best part of the story, depending on your point of view, is that a couple of weeks later, those tomato slices were still lying on the ground, practically indestructible. I mean, this is the story of the modern tomato, and it's not getting any better either. And my son, youngest son, who's teaches Ag Econ at Tennessee Tech, recently took a group of students to Holland to visit acres and acres of greenhouses they have over there. And what he discovered was, with their tomatoes, they are grown for flavor and texture and nutrition, the exact opposite of the ones that we grow here. It's amazing. I went a long way around to answer your question. Yes.
So with 700 varieties, and given how long they last to seed, how many do you have to plan out each season to keep the stock fresh?
Well, since they last for at least 35 years, I don't have to plant a lot of it. Although my son down at Tennessee Tech is growing a lot of it each year. He's going to try to grow over 100 varieties this year himself. He's trying to work with a guy down there to see what he can do about maybe having part of our operation at least moved down there, because I discovered that I'm a little bit vulnerable when I had to have this hip operation last year, and I can't do nearly as much as I used to be able to do. And Brian is not able to take over for me and him. I'm trying to spread out the responsibility in several places, but I'm not worried. In the freezer, we got 6 freezers, and I'm not worried about any of my seeds going stale. It was my mother's 35-year-old seeds that convinced me that is not a concern of mine anymore.
So besides Brian, do you have other young people that you're training to do this work?
Well, we have 1 or 2 almost every summer. I've been trying to recruit students from Red to do it. Our organization is not for profit, and all of our seed sales go to help pay for interns during the summer. So I am, of course, most college students tend to be more attracted to faraway places rather than local. And so I have one student who is an agriculture. I'm hoping that will come this summer. He hasn't signed a contract yet. But we try every summer to get 2 or 3. We've had as many as 3, as few as 1. And then, of course, I've had Brian for 12 years now, so that's a big help. Yes.
When we're planting beans, do they need to be separated, or might you just plant one variety a year? I mean, in terms of cross-pollination? Is that an
Well,
issue?
cross-pollination theoretically is not a problem because the pollination occurs prior to the molting. However, I've discovered that there are some varieties, most notably the goose bean, that apparently has a very attractive and very tender bloom that bumblebees can rip open and cross-pollinate during the pollination process. But that's the only bean I've ever had any problem with cross-pollinating. My rows are 6 feet to 7 feet, excuse me. And I've also discovered that bumblebees tend to go in a linear fashion down the row instead of crossing the rows. And but whenever I grow goose beans, I'm trying to make sure that I have them separated in terms of time of planting or geographically. And actually, I've had my son growing them in Tennessee for the last few years too. But typically, it's not a problem. And I plant 2 seeds every 18 inches. I plant 2 seeds so that they can help each other break the soil and break their backs. Seed companies say to sow your beans and then thin them. And then they tell you to maybe thin them to 2 inches or something like that. Most people grow their beans far, far too thick. If you will, let me just pass this around. A picture of my granddaughter, you'll see this later. Well, go ahead and pass this around now. And show some of those lazy wild greases being grown in a high tunnel, going up 12, 14 feet and back down. Now here's another. This is that looks like kudzu, but that's my beans. Most people have forgotten, the potential of beans. And a good cornfield bean will yield 10 times as much what a bush bean will yield. And the seed company operators think that the typical gardeners are ignorant, and typically they are ignorant in the sense that they don't have the experience on this. But also, I need to mention that greasy beans, the Asheville Farmers Market, Western Carolina Farmers Market, will bring up to 10 times as much as Blue Lakes will on the wholesale market. At one time, I was at the Asheville Market, and Blue Lakes were selling machine harvested at $7 a bushel. And greasy beans can bring upwards of $100 or more per bushel. I mean, it's just astounding. And once people have eaten them, I mean, we've shipped seeds to all 50 states. And England, France, Germany, Norway, shipped a lot to New Zealand, Australia, and a lot to Canada just last week to Canada. It is truly amazing. Once people have eaten these beans, how it turns them around. And I get letters all the time saying, I bought beans at the Asheville Farmers Market. Do you have beans like that? And I have to say, yes, I do. That's where I got a lot of my beans. In fact, there used to be a fellow who died Roosevelt Hemingway too, who died a few years ago. When the actual market first opened, I would go there every time in my trip back home to North Carolina, and I would visit Clive Whit, and he knew when I started coming, he would say, "Come back and pick the yellow beans from his collection there, and take them home and dry them out, and have a new variety of beans." That's how I got many of my bean varieties, was from a commercial source, but they were heirloom beans. Yes.
You refer to corn to a bean. You sort of will be in with corn or the top corn.
I've stopped doing that because modern corns are too weak. They can barely hold their own ear. The sweet corns especially. But if you've got a good heirloom corn, but I don't even grow heirloom corn anymore because I live on the edge of 8,000 acres of forest, and I have more varmints than you can imagine. That just take care of. They just strip the corn down. So I create trellises.
You see, do well growing some like bloody bush corn, like it was a whole into the hour, strictly trouble.
Oh, they would. They would, yes. And especially if you've got it spread out just a little bit. The reason I grow on trellises is that I want as much sun as possible on the bean vines, and I get a much heavier yield growing on trellises. And we put the trellises just as high as we can reach. And I also grow some on bean towers, take bicycle wheels and put them on top of a 14-foot cedar post or something like that, and bring the strings down. You can see some of this on my website. I would recommend my website to any of you. And my friend Frank Barnett has a lot of beautiful color photographs on the website. That can show you how we do it. But I grow virtually all of mine. I grow a few on the corn now, just once in a while, just to look at. But for the really harvesting these, we grow them on trellises, 7 feet, rows 7 feet wide. We try to get maximum production out of it because I don't have that much level land anyhow.
I'm surprised you can send beans internationally. I mean, there's so many laws and regulations. You're like certified or?
The ones that I sent to New Zealand, I went through the Seed Savers Exchange. They apparently are licensed to do that. And the people that I sent them to in New Zealand asked that I do that. They had already been buying at the Seed Savers Exchange. And I had to, when I sent some last week to Canada, I had to fill out some forms to do it. Now, the ones that I've sent to England, France, and Norway, I didn't do that. So I don't know. I don't know what the deal is. I guess I'll keep doing it until I get in trouble, until somebody gets in trouble. But mostly, we've shipped all 50 states, including Hawaii and Alaska, where they grow in high tones. Some question up there? Yes.
We've been experimenting growing beans and different kinds of polycultures, whole beans anyway, and cornfield beans, and on amaranth and sunflowers and corn as well, and oat grow too. We've been noticing that usually it seems like the beans yield a lot less when they're growing up other plants. You think that's just because of lack of sun or competition with the host plant itself?
I think in both cases, yeah, I think you're right. But that's why I've gone drifting completely into trellis in mine. I mean, I've tried it many ways over many years. But the TP style poles, my neighbor taught me that was not a way. He had probably a tenth of an acre of beautiful beans on TP style. We had one storm one night. We walked out the next day. They were all lying on the ground. So I try to take the weather into consideration when I'm doing this, and I try to save myself as much work as possible. Now, trellising them there's a lot of work. But once you get the trellises put up, then about all you have to do is pick after that, and it works very well. But I would recommend that you look at some of the ways that we do it on our website too. But the bean towers, like my neighbor is used, sometimes he will make it out of concrete reinforcing wire and put maybe three on top of another, have it 12 feet up at least, but then he'll have a stiff pole on the inside to control them even after that. Beans are sometimes hard to grow, but I think it's worth the effort. Worth the effort. At least for me, it has been.
If you have, say, for your fall harvest, if you're trying to store food for a large number of people, what would you consider, if you have a somewhat limited amount of mason canning jars, what would you consider to be the most valuable use for those jars? Any thoughts
Which bean
on that?
variety you mean?
Yeah, beans or just anything in particular that you would want to use your mason jars for at fall harvest that you think would be more valuable than something else?
I think if I would be choosing between beans and corn, I would choose beans over corn. But I know people who still put up 300 or 400 quarts. Yes, ma'am.
You started to tell us, what is your favorite bean to can?
Pardon?
What is your favorite bean to can?
One that. Yeah. One that I call the non-tough hack runner. That came to, I'll tell you the story on this too. One of my friends who was teaching in community college in Lexington a few years ago, I saw him at a conference and he said, I've got some beans I need to give you. And so he gave me a bean. His father was retired, his father-in-law was a retired minister. He said, I got this for my father-in-law. And I called the father-in-law and he said, I got it from in Breathitt County I was mentioning a while ago. He said, I got it from a sawmill operator. And so I called the sawmill operator and he said, I'm sorry, we don't grow that anymore. He said, my children refuse to grow anything except stringless bunch beans. So, and I had, from him, I got the best bean I've got. Anyhow, it had 3 variants in it, and I was trying to isolate one of them, and because I was particularly fond of it, and it just so happened that I had an 18-feet section of trellis that had one bean survive. The others had drowned out because I had a little swag in my row, and the one on the very end survived and occupied nearly 18 feet of trellis, had 286 bean pods and nearly a pound of seed from one plant. And that's how I came across that, because it was the one that I was trying to isolate. I'm still trying to isolate the other 2. But that is by far our best-selling bean, something on the order of 4 or 5 times as much as, it's even more popular than the greasy beans. But it's an outstanding bean. Now the 2 beans that I have from this area are one the Cana Hack Runner and the other is a Spangler bean. The Spangler bean I got from Harold Gerald, who's a retired county agent in Lee County. But let me just mention some of the other beans that I've got. Just tell you a little bit of the story on them. The NC Hack Runner, I just told you, the Spangler. The turkey crawl, within a 100-mile radius of Cumberland Gap in all 3 states. It's very popular, very popular. The greasy back is very close to my favorite greasy bean because it's, and if some of you will look at the KET video on our website, it's one of the ones featured in that video. The Cana, C-A-N-A, half runner is from here in Virginia too, is an excellent half runner. I grew for the first time last summer. This small speckled greasy cut short is from West Virginia, given to me by a fellow who was born and raised in the valley here in Virginia. The Frank Barnett cut short I mentioned a while ago is being true breeding mutant. The white half runner greasy, it was sent to us as a half runner bean, and we discovered it was a greasy too, because in many mountain communities, people don't refer to greasy beans as greasy beans. They just call them cornfield beans, like in my home community in North Carolina, because they were all greasy beans. So, you know, that's just adding an additional word to it. But that's an excellent greasy bean as well. Josephine Jackson, half runners from Pike County, Kentucky. And the goose bean, which is known throughout the southern Appalachians. That's and the one I mentioned that is bad to cross. And that's why I brought it down too. But anyhow, we have all of these beans. You can have any of them for sale. They're all $6 a packet. And as I mentioned, the money is what goes to help pay for our interns during the summer. My wife's my retirement just goes so far, so I can't subsidize it too much.
Did you have something to do with the mortgage lifter, maybe?
The mortgage lifter?
Yeah.
I raised it, and I've got the story of the mortgage lifter in here, but I didn't have anything to do with that. That was from a fellow in Radiator Charlie, who I tried to get the straight story on that from, I think, one of his nephews who was and I sought out the information on that. But he crossed four tomatoes to develop that mortgage lifter. Yeah. It's a real good tomato.
I was wondering, you mentioned isolating some of the genetics from certain beans, and what is your process if you're looking for certain traits in a variety that has some variation in it? What do? Do you just separate it and let it go, or do you just kind of do trial and error? Or?
Both. trial and error, and the way I did this MT half runner, it just came to me purely by accident. I had been trying to isolate it, but unsuccessfully, and then suddenly it happened just to me by accident, and it bred true the next year. It was in really great shape. But several of my beans, come in two variants all the time, and then they're always. Then, if you have a variant and you plant it and it breeds true, then, for example, I have a turkey crow variant, but I sell as a turkey crow variant. But then, after a few years, it achieves its own identity, and then may even have its own variants after that. That's what is so magical about beans, is that there are so many varieties, and there are always mutants happening almost year by year. And I hear about them all the time. Yes.
To stay on the genetics thing here, I was curious, as you gather strains, beans from different areas, do you find that those that have been bred for a long time in one area are particularly good in that soil? Are they disease resistant for that area? Are there any peculiar characteristics that make them better for an area, or is it just based on people's preferences and flavor and so forth?
I think the latter is maybe more based on people's preferences and flavor. The beans that I send out do very well in Florida, Texas, Idaho, California, Oregon, Washington, even Montana, Minnesota. I mean, and they've been carried to all those places by people who migrated there, and they just do well. And of course, when you gather your seeds each year, I'm sure they're gathering the ones that did best, and so there's a certain amount of selection taking place during that time. Yeah. But beans of the southern Appalachians have done extremely well everywhere they've been taken. But now, a few years ago, I had a fellow from South America. He just came by to visit me. He was visiting Berea College, and he came by to visit me, and he had a pocket full of beans. He said, I'd like to give you these. And I tried all of his beans that he gave me. There were 2 or 3 varieties, and not a single one grew to produce other beans. The vines came up, they were very weak, and I tried my best to take care of them, but they just wouldn't do it. But these were from South America. So it may be that these beans, they've been growing in the southern Appalachians for at least 1,000 years. In my new book that's coming out, hopefully by this time next year, I have a lady, an archaeologist from University of Kentucky part-time, and the Kentucky Archaeological Society, and they've found several beans in Kentucky that the first time I ever heard her speak about 10 years ago, she had photographs of some beans that I recognized the shape of. They were cut shorts, like the cut shorts I sent around a few minutes ago. And I talked with her about it, and she said, this is a great to know that these beans were being grown here in Kentucky 1,000 years ago. But it's amazing, yes.
What kind of fertilizer and pesticides do you use?
I don't use much fertilizer because they provide their own nitrogen, and I'm planting mine where I had been growing tomatoes for a number of years, and so the last couple of years I haven't put any fertilizer on them at all, but I may have to start doing that. I intend to do a soil test and just find out if I'm going to need to start adding something, but for Japanese beetles and Mexican bean beetles, you remember the name of it? I think it's from it's an organic one from the marigolds. Is it marigolds? I can't remember the name of it. Pyrethrum. Right. And it worked very well. And if you get it on soon enough, it works even better. I would say that if you, in a situation and you have to use 7, I would use that before the blooms start appearing. That in a published article, when I said, why grow beans at all? Mow your lawn, put it in the pot, then you can have grass-like grass, and not even go through having grass-like beans. Needless to say, that was the last year they advertised their beans as being grass-like. But that is the problem right now, is that you are instructed to pick while young and tender. What I'm saying is pick while old and tender. Pick when the seeds are fully formed, but before they start turning yellow. Let the seeds form fully, maximum protein, then and cook them ham hock or something like that, the traditional way. Some people use olive oil, things like this. I mean, there are many ways of doing it. I prefer the traditional way, and my wife usually bacon.
Do you have a foolproof planting date, some folklore?
When the sign are in the arms, Gemini.
Which is
That's as foolproof as I know.
coming
And I was taught that by my neighbor, who I pointed out to her one day. I said, Lucy, your beans are always better than mine. And she says, well, I noticed you almost always plant the wrong sign. And I took my calendar over there and I said, you mark the signs off for me. And then suddenly my beans started doing better than hers, and I pointed that out. And she said, well, they should be. Your ground's better than mine. But I try to do that as much as I can. I think there is something to that. I think when you have these heavenly bodies that influence the tides and things like this, they're obviously going to impact
So, Gemini,
life
is
as
that
well.
sometime in May?
And you just have to look at the calendar. I haven't even checked it for this year. Yeah, there's 2 or 3 days each month. Excuse me.
You take your trellises down and move them around, or do you have the trellises set in a permanent spot?
No, I move them around, because I have to plow them around each year. I remove everything. I plant everything on plastic-covered raised beds with drip irrigation underneath the plastic. And then each year, and I mow between my rows. I don't plow, I don't cultivate. I just let, and that way we can pick, if it's rained or something like this, we mow between rows. The plastic covers about 3 feet. So it's 4-foot plastic, maybe only 2.5 feet or something like that. Covered like this. Thank you. That dust is getting
Yes.
good. Yes.
Do you have a certain set of rotation you do with different crops, following the beans or choose something? You mentioned about green tomatoes.
I've grown tomatoes in the same high tunnels for 14 years now. The rotation that I'm using right now is that I'm not growing nearly as many tomatoes as I used to, so I've converted most of my tomato ground to bean ground. But I'll keep doing that until I start getting a disease or something like that. My beans have been remarkably disease-free for whatever reason. It may be because my rows are so wide. I don't know. But we've had very few disease problems. We do have some insect problems, but no disease problems yet. That's after 40-some years.
Blight on tomatoes seems to be really bad here. What do you do about blight?
Blight, I've never had it, so I don't know. It may be because we clean our ground up. We plow in a cover crop each fall, and maybe my sanitation practices keep me from having it. I don't know, but I've heard of people having it, and I've heard of them having bacterial problems also, but I've never had blight. So, remarkably free of disease, and maybe it's just my luck. I don't know. I don't know whether it's anything I've done or not. I can rationalize it and say it, but I just don't know.
Are all your tomatoes in the high tunnel?
All of my tomatoes this year are going to be in high tunnels, except for some that I'm growing for seed, where I had a high tunnel collapse, and due to snow and ice. So I've only got 2 high tunnels this year instead of 3. But I will space my tomatoes out a little bit that I'm saving for seed. In my other high tunnels, and the one that we've got that is in pretty good shape right now, I use bumblebees to do the pollinating, and the other one will have the doors and sides rolled up so that they will get pollinated, I think, just by the wind alone.
Yeah. I learned a lot about beans and corn and heirloom varieties and everything when I was in Arizona. Going to school there at a liberal arts college, Prescott College. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's kind of similar to Berea in a way.
Right.
But one of the things we did there is we went to the Hopi Reservation and spoke with a lot of their the elders there that are still growing their heirloom varieties that have been passed down for thousands of years, and they don't really isolate their corn or bean varieties, but it's because they're growing different species. I was wondering if you have different species of beans, are like greasy beans a different species than Rhizophaseolus vulgaris?
Right. I guess the butter beans are not Phaseus vulgaris, but I do have a friend, Tony West, and you can look him up on the internet as well, who grows a lot of corns. has to keep them isolated, and he isolates them by planting dates. He has friends also who keep them isolated, and he grows for the southern exposure seed exchange. But, I don't know. I couldn't answer the question about the Hopi. I'm just not sure about that. I was a biology major, but I'm not a plant scientist. I'm a plant collector. So I don't claim any special expertise in terms of breeding. I do know how to seize the opportunity to grow human beings, and I've had real good success. Let me take a couple more questions. My throat is about to wear out. This has been a good group. You all ask intelligent questions.
I'm curious as to what Brian is studying in school, when we're going to hear from Brian about the next generation. I'll give him a chance to practice.
Just doing gen ed right now. I haven't decided what I want to do. I was thinking maybe business school or something like that. I know pretty well how to farm. I don't know a lot about business aspects of farming. That'd be a worthwhile investment.
I didn't major in agriculture myself. I took one ag class in vegetable gardening when I started Korea in '54, and I honestly felt that I knew more than the professor did. No, I started in math and then finished in biology. And my master's is in biology, is in physical education and recreation, especially modern dance. My doctorate is in Appalachian studies with theoretical specialty in aesthetics. But I've literally farmed all my life. I started out as a farmer, and I'm finishing up as a farmer. So I felt that I learned enough. My father had a 7th grade education. He was a scientific farmer. He took all kinds of ag journals. My mother was a high school graduate, and she was a folk farmer. And I've moved more toward the folk side of it than the scientific side of it. I was the North Carolina corn growing champion in 1951 as a 15-year-old 4-H student. Just had a new corn growing record for the state of North Carolina, and won myself a trip to the 4-H Club Congress in Chicago. But I no longer grow any hybrid corns. That was a brand new hybrid that did very well for me. Like I say, I've moved more back toward my mother's techniques than toward my father's techniques. But I've done them both, and I think what I'm doing now is more important as far as the future is concerned. Yes?
For the benefit of the novice folks who are watching these videos that the library is going to put out, what basic bean planting advice would you give those folks who perhaps have never planted beans before or have minimal experience?
Seed planting advice?
Yes.
Well, as far as beans are concerned, don't plant too deep, don't plant too early. 2 seeds every 18 inches I found works best for me. 2 seeds together helps them break the soil together, especially if you've got a clay soil. But your soil needs to be damp but not wet. And again, two seeds for every 18 inches, because I've discovered that most people plant their seeds way too thick. And then trellis them as high as you can reach. Put them as high as you can reach. Or be prepared if you use poles and the teepee style, be prepared to use the step ladder or something like that. I have Brian, when I grow bean towers, I have him lift me up with the front end lift of the Kubota tractor, and I pick beans up 12 feet tall. And if you want to grow a lot of beans on a single vine, that's the way to go. Is develop bean towers. There's a lot of exciting things you can do with beans. The website is heirlooms.org. HEIRLOOMS.org, and it's on our seed packets, and I'm sure it's in the book as well. But we've got the seed packets for sale and the books for sale if any of you would like to buy. Thank you all very much.